Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks to Carlos too for the invitation to come here today. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of present to you today a kind of few thoughts on architecture's long-standing but slightly strained relationship to writing. And I'm going to do that through a lecture that basically draws upon my experience of teaching and editing architecture, and a talk that it's going to be partly historical, partly technical, and almost wholly polemical. In terms of that polemic, what I'm not going to present is a kind of guide to becoming a better writer, partly because the internet is full of these things. 10 rules for the aspiring writer, or writing for dummies, or even there's actually a rather good book by Umberto Eco called How to Write a Thesis. But partly I'm not going to be covering that because I don't want to present anything quite so categorical or definitive. So you're not going to become a better writer by following a prescribed template or a set of rules. I think you're going to become better by working at it, by writing. Ironically, you'll become a better writer by reading more too, and more widely. Good writers are always good readers. And so to encourage this sort of reading component, I'm going to present this talk to you today as much as I can through quotation. So nearly all of my slides are going to be words, are going to be quotes. Let's see if this works. Okay, so in privileging quotation, I should also add that I'm opposing the American essayist and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose own recommendation to aspiring writers was to demonize all forms of quotation, and who preferred a writer to instead only articulate their own thoughts and feelings. Tell me what you know, said Emerson. And in opposing Emerson, I'm also going to be endorsing Walter Benjamin here, as in elsewhere, and who, despite all the attention he receives, is still worth it, largely because he is such a wonderful writer. Benjamin maintained a contrary view that quotation, even if a bit illicit, a bit illegal, is actually rather useful. So my talk is going to be full of robbers by the roadside. Now, with that out of the way, I think, and to sort of immediately contradict myself, I just wanted to begin with an image and to first explain my title a little bit. This is the American writer Truman Capote in a photograph taken in New Orleans by the great French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. Now, Capote is one of those strange people whose more recent photographs make him look like someone from the 19th century, with a Panama hat and bow tie and braces. While in photographs of him as a young man, this was actually taken in 1947, when he was just 23, he looks incredibly contemporary. 10 years after this picture was taken, Capote was asked his opinion on another up-and-coming American writer, Jack Kerouac, famously the author of On the Road, and a pioneer of the beat movement, and a style of writing defined by its kind of hipster prose and syncopated jazz-influenced rhythms. Capote's own writing operated according to a completely different set of values, highly controlled, almost mannered, and with very, very precise use of punctuation and a slightly affected sense of style. As a result, Capote had little time for Kerouac and dismissed On the Road as not writing but typing. That is, text that had not been considered or crafted, but was just mechanically plonked down on a page. Now, personally, I actually rather like Kerouac, in many ways more than I do Capote, but I do think the distinction he makes is useful, certainly when we consider it in relationship to architecture, where, as you may have guessed, even if you don't yet know, there is frankly far too much typing and hardly any writing. Okay, but let's have this is the first of the kind of architectural quotes, and explore this discrepancy between writing and typing a little more in more detail. Perhaps the best post-war architectural critic was the English historian Reyner Banham. And in one of his less celebrated architectural homilies, Banham anointed Le Corbusier's famous modernist manifesto, Vers une architecture, as the only piece of architectural writing that will be classed among the essential literature of the 20th century. Now, despite the fact that this testimonial is printed on the back cover of all English editions of the book, it remains somewhat overlooked. In my experience, no professor of architecture ever begins a lecture on the text by prefacing their remarks, as Reyner Banham once noted, and no architectural student ever places this quote as an epigraph to their own papers and writing on the architect. Now, perhaps one of the reasons for its relative obscurity is the measure by which Banham was appraising Le Corbusier. Vers une architecture was not being invited into an architectural or art historical vanguard, nor an intellectual, philosophical, or technological pantheon, but a literary canon. So the book is being promoted as great literature. Now, to me, there's something interesting in this association, not least because among all the glorious and vainglorious platitudes typically bestowed upon an architectural work, that it is most important, that it is most harmonious, that it is most original, the idea that an architect can write beautifully, that they are most literary, has never been among them. Now, the cynical onlooker would point out that this omission merely reflects the fact that one of the architecture's enduring paradoxes is that for a discipline long presented to us as a language, very few architects have exhibited any kind of ability to write. Okay, as proof, let's look at some historical examples. Now this, for instance, is the opening 2 sentences of Book 1 of Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture. These are the very first 2 sentences. So this is the first ever piece of architectural writing in the first ever architectural publication by the first ever architect. So in a sense, this is architecture's equivalent to the book of Genesis and its own memorable opening line, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That's how the book of Genesis opens. So empowered with the responsibility of firstness, this is what Vitruvius comes up with. Now, I usually hate it when people read quotes on the screen in the lecture, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to do it. And this one is quite a quotation, so just bear with me. "While your divine intelligence and will, Imperator Caesar, were engaged in acquiring the right to command the world, and while your fellow citizens, when all their enemies had been laid low by your invincible valor, were glorying in your triumphant victory, while all foreign nations were in subjection, awaiting your beck and call, and the Roman people and Senate, released from their alarm, were beginning to be guided by your most noble conceptions and policies, I hardly dared, in view of your serious employment, to publish my writings and long-considered ideas on architecture, for fear of subjecting myself to your displeasure by an unseasonable interruption." Sentence number 1. "But when I saw that you were giving your attention not only to the welfare of society in general and to the establishment of public order, but also to the providing of public buildings intended for utilitarian purposes, so that not only should the state have been enriched with provinces by your means, but the greatness of its power might likewise be attended with distinguished authority in its public buildings, I thought that I ought to take the first opportunity to lay before you my writings on this theme." That's how it begins. That's our great book as architects. Let's look at another one. Let's jump forward 2,000 years and look at this. This is a rather more lyrical effort. This is the introductory passage, again, the very beginning of Frank Lloyd Wright's 1943 An Autobiography. "A light blanket of snow, fresh fallen over sloping fields, gleaming in the morning sun. Clusters of pod-topped weeds woven of bronze here and there, sprinkling the spotless expanse of white. Dark sprays of slender metallic straight lines tipped with quivering dots, patterned to the eye of the sun as the sun spread delicate network of more patterned blue shadows on the white underneath. Come, my boy, said Uncle John to his sister Anna's 9-year-old. Come now and I will show you how to go." Let's do another one. Lastly, this is something much more contemporary. This is Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron writing in the opening lines, again, this is another opening, of their 1990 text, Passionate Infidelity. What is the architecture we seek, the architecture we move towards, the architecture that drives us, pushes us forward, that wants us to be discovered, to be brought out from the seclusion of our architectural consciousness, or rather subconsciousness, the architecture that pushes us towards the light, like an insect, and when there, fulfills its inescapable fate, the architecture we think, draw, imagine, describe, the architecture we photograph and capture on video, the one we define as correct, or at least more important than the other, older or contemporary architecture. Without us, it does not exist, and without it, we do not exist. Now, it was not difficult to find these quotations. Open any book by any architect in any architectural library, and you will find versions of the same kinds of passages. And after reading these and other quotations, I think it's important to state an obvious fact, that by and large, architects have always been, and presumably will always remain, absolutely terrible writers. I mean, wretchedly bad, abject. From the first to the last, their literary efforts offer nothing but either obsequiousness, as with Vitruvius, a kind of sentimental, lunatic lyricism, as with Frank Lloyd Wright, or more typically, almost by default, sheer, unadulterated narcissism, as with Herzog and de Meuron. In fact, in rarer, more self-analytical moments, even architects themselves recognize that this degree of vanity is what defines them as architects. As the mischievous Philip Johnson once noted, if architects weren't arrogant, they wouldn't be architects. I don't know a modest, good architect. Now, of course, the exception to all this is Le Corbusier, intergalactically arrogant. But as Banham suggests, his writing alone offers architecture's most compelling form of literature. And I think he's right. Le Corbusier's prose really is fantastic, especially when he is preaching and proselytizing on modern architecture, which, let's face it, is most of the time, turning the manifesto into a kind of poetry. And this was something he displayed not just in one or two famous works, but in hundreds of books, articles, and journals, resulting in a body of published work more numerous than his buildings. Le Corbusier is far more productive as a writer than he is as a builder. So Le Corbusier is architecture's literary savior. Well, this at least is what I thought. Because recently I read an essay by the scholar Beatrice Colomina on Le Corbusier called Vers une architecture médiatique. Now, Colomina begins her essay with a really bold piece of iconoclasm. Le Corbusier, she says, published 79 books, authored 511 articles, edited 55 journals, and produced the script for 13 documentary films and 20 radio broadcasts. But he couldn't write. His first attempt to publish the text written in the form of a travel journal during his voyage to the Orient in 1911 had to be edited by his mother before they were sent to La Feuille d'Avis, a newspaper in his hometown of La Chaux-de-Fonds, who published them as a series while he was still traveling. More radically still, Colomina then shows how Le Corbusier himself, seemingly one never to experience any moment of self-doubt, was in reality continually embarrassed by the quality of his writing. As late as 1965, the year he died, he wrote this dedication to his brother Albert at the front of his The Voyage to the Orient when it was eventually published. Surely you know, Le Corbusier writes, how I wish this piece that I am dedicating to you were better. But I have nothing else. You know only too well how much these lines, written for an audience who really didn't want them, have tarnished the joy and disturbed the serenity with which everything there filled me. The other day they told me about the conviction with which you defended my French during your stay here this summer. My very poor, sad, incompetent French. Now this, I think, is a bit of a problem. And it's a problem because, as I said, architecture has always been sold to us as a language. And although architects typically practice this language metaphorically through their built works, they have also always practiced it literally through their published work, especially in the modern period when, like Le Corbusier, architects now typically write more than they build. Just think of figures like Peter Eisenman or Rem Koolhaas, both of whom published long before they ever built. but who now are we supposed to revere if the first ever architect, Vitruvius, was a terrible writer? If America's greatest architect, so-called greatest architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, is worse than terrible because he's trying so hard, and if arguably the best contemporary architects, in Herzog and de Meuron, produce words that just make you cringe, and that even Le Corbusier, historically one of our only literary saviours, was actually getting his mother to write all of his texts, because his own prose, by his own admission, was very poor, very sad and incompetent. Now, more recently, this problem has become compounded by statements like this. This is a quote from Mark Wigley, a first-rate architectural historian, a critic and a theorist, and the former dean of the School of Architecture at Columbia, who, despite all the evidence to the contrary, evidence that you've just seen, still maintains that I don't write about architects today because I think they write. I would rather read an architect than read a critic on the architect's work. I have never read anyone who writes about Kohlhaas's work that's interesting. So the situation we face now is 2,000 years of, as we have seen, largely terrible writing by architects, and still we get critics and academics proudly telling us that we should not write about architecture because architects themselves do this better than anybody else. And as a case in point, he cites an apparently important Dutch architect called Rem somebody or other. Now, speaking personally, the idea that architects cannot write about architecture and that critics will not write about architecture is an especial problem for me because I'm not an architect but an architectural editor and a publisher. And until very recently, I edited lots of books on architecture, as well as editing and publishing an architectural journal called AA Files, a stack of which you can see here. I've always liked the objects of architecture, mostly the buildings, but also the drawings, the photographs, and the architects themselves, as much as I've also always loved good writing. And so the ambition then was only ever to put these things together, to produce compelling thoughts and texts about architecture, and to break with the tradition of architectural writing that's too vain, too lyrical, too theoretical, or just too boring. The only reassurance I could find in this ambition was the sense that this situation was not unique to architecture. This is a quote from a friend of mine. This is the English analyst and writer Adam Phillips, who is bemoaning the absence of good writing in his own discipline of psychoanalysis. And Phillips, just like me, was crying out for more good sentences. But before we get too much further into this, I think we need to be clear, first of all, what the hell is a good sentence? And how do I know a good one from a bad one? So as a kind of parlor game now, I thought we should just familiarize ourselves with some great sentences. And the ones I've chosen have all been written by novelists. So not people whose mothers have written their text for them, but professional writers, so writers, not typists. And all of the examples I'm about to show you are all the first lines, the very first sentences or first passages from their books. So here's the first of them. This is Jane Austen's very famous opening sentence to Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. I mean, one of literature's great sentences. Oh, here's Herman Melville's very famous beginning to Moby Dick, Call Me Ishmael. Or this is Dostoevsky's opening sentence with the ellipse to Notes from Underground. I'm a sick man, I'm a spiteful man. Again, one hell of a sentence. Or this is the opening sentence to Proust's À la recherche de temps perdu. For a long time, I went to bed early. That's it. Well, this is the opening sentence to J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. But now let's continue the same game, the same kind of parlor game, and test out Mark Wigley's contention that critics and historians have nothing interesting or compelling to say about architecture. Now, initially, when you do this little survey, you feel slightly smug in actually defeating Mark Wigley, because in reaching for a kind of staple of the architectural academics library, you find this fantastic opening sentence. This is the famous opening of Nicholas Pevsner's An Outline of European Architecture. Actually not a very good book, but a wonderful piece of writing, and one of the most famous and best architectural introductions. A bicycle shed is a building, Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture. Nearly everything that encloses space on a scale sufficient for a human being to move in is a building. The term architecture applies only to buildings designed with a view to aesthetic appeal. For me, architecture's best opening sentence. But then in continuing through architecture's historical canon, you realize that maybe Wigley was onto something, because all of the great works of architectural historiography, so works written by historians and critics, not by architects, and these are the books that academics all have on their bookcases, and the books that students have on their reading lists, all have a certain, they're slightly lacking in a certain literary finesse. So let's just sort of spin through this canon very quickly. This is the opening sentence of Gottfried Semper's On Architectural Styles. A fairly dour opening sentence. Or this is the way Heinrich Wölfflin begins his Renaissance and Baroque. Again, not telling me anything particularly exciting here. Or this is the opening of Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson's The International Style. An amazing exhibition, a terrible book. Well, this is the ludicrously long first sentence to Rudolf. This is one sentence. This is Rudolf Wittkower's beginning to his essay on Carlo Rinaldi. I can't read this one; it's just too long. But it's it's not a literary sentence. It's data. It's a historian who knows everything, basically setting it up didactically, pedagogically. There is no intention here to somehow embellish his words with some sort of finesse. Well, here's Siegfried Gideon's The Beginning of Space, Time and Architecture. Again, a momentously important book, a momentously boring opening sentence. Well, this is Manfredo Tafuri's beginning of The Sphere and the Labyrinth. I'm being slightly unfair to many of these writers because obviously I'm putting up quotations that are translated, but with Tafuri for sure, every Italian tells me he couldn't write in Italian any better than he could write in English. Now, ironically, you'll also discover that even Mark Wigley, who's someone resolutely part of this same tradition, falls into the same trap, writing a fairly nonsensical opening to his first book, The Architecture of Deconstruction. How then to translate deconstruction in architectural discourse? That's how he begins, as if everybody was asking themselves the same question. What is deconstruction? Now, interestingly, to this list of terrible architectural openings, we can even add Rainer Banham, whose first sentence to his book, Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, is spectacularly turgid. Banham writes, while a series of revolutionary gestures around 1910, largely connected with the Cubist and Futurist movements, were the main point of departure for the development of modern architecture, there are also a number of particular predisposing causes that helped to guide the mainstream of development into the channels through which it flowed in the 1920s. That's how he begins the book. But then what makes Banham absolutely adorable, lovable, is that the last two lines of the book are utterly wonderful. Perhaps the best end to any architectural book. This is the very famous end of the architect who proposes to run with technology knows that he will be in fast company, and in order to keep up, he may have to emulate the futurists and discard his whole cultural load, including the professional garments by which he is recognized as an architect. If, on the other hand, he decides not to do this, he may find that a technological culture has decided to go on without him. Fantastic piece of writing. So I think it is here, it's actually precisely here, more than in any other location in the first and last pages of Banham's Theory and Design, that one can discern writing from typing and see exemplars of bad and good models of how to write. And I think it's also important to note that in evolving out of one model and into another, Banham was also moving the discipline of architectural writing from one established lineage of figures into a totally other tradition. Now, this is me being slightly more didactic. The more ingrained tradition characteristic of the opening of Theory and Design is this one. This is the prevailing lineage of largely German scholars who fundamentally established the way art and architectural history is written. As a kind of test, you can test yourself in who they are, but from the top row they are Winckelmann, then Semper, Burckhardt, Riegel, Schmarzow, and then in the middle row you've got Wolflin, Gideon smack in the middle, and then Erwin Panofsky on the right. And in the bottom row there's Gombrich, Wittkower, and Pevsner himself. Now, in many cases, each of these people taught their successor, so this is a true lineage of architectural historians, with Pevsner at the end actually being Banham's own teacher. Pevsner supervised Banham's PhD. So in effect, Banham would be the absent 12th man on this list. Now, these men, and of course they are all men, may seem very old and far removed from anything you might be thinking or doing in a school of architecture today. But it is still the case that almost everything you do in terms of writing about architecture, and everything architectural academics do in terms of teaching architectural history, has its root in these 11 guys. And also, you're actually not quite so far removed from them as you might think. As I said, Banham is Pevsner's student. Banham's own student slash assistant was Adrian Forty, who taught me, and I am here in front of you. So you are, by that definition, 15 places away from Winckelmann. You're 15 in line to the throne. Now, collectively, these scholars have contributed in immeasurable ways to the elucidation of art and architectural writing, surveying and in some sense defining all the major movements, but at the same time they have chosen to do this by communicating their thoughts in words that are often rather dry and formulaic, always privileging history as a repository of immutable data and research rather than any opportunity to tell an engaging story or write a beautiful sentence. Now, the alternative tradition demonstrated by Banham's final sentence in Theory and Design is this one. This is an entirely different set of characters, still regarded with some suspicion inside the university because most of them were not academics, but journalists and writers, trades that academics have traditionally been very, very sniffy about. I mean, they still are. Academics are very dismissive of journalists. Now, again, in chronological order, this is Montaigne, top left, then Francis Bacon, Samuel Johnson, William Hazlitt, Charles Lamb, John Ruskin, Thomas de Quincey. Then on the middle, you've got Walter Pater, G.K. Chesterton, the great Walter Benjamin, smack in the middle, Virginia Woolf, an essayist of equal standing to her abilities as a novelist, and Aldous Huxley in the middle right. And on the bottom line is Theodore Adorno on the far left, then the wonderful Roland Barthes, Susan Sontag, and Joan Didion in the bottom right. Now, these people represent an alternative tradition, not just because they sat outside of the academy, but mainly because of the form of writing they all endorsed, writing not manifestos, nor treatises, nor surveys or papers, but only and ever essays. A form that I think should be at the heart of your own reading and a model for your own academic writing, regardless of whether it is a paper, a thesis, or a PhD. First pioneered by the French Renaissance writer Montaigne, who was in the top left, in the late 16th century, the essay was invented as a way to test complicated ideas in a literary form that was simple and clear. Something reflected in its etymology, for the word derives from the French essayer, meaning to try or to attempt. And so in contrast to the assuredness and confidence of the manifesto, architecture's default form of literature, an essay revels in self-doubt. Or at least in an essay, what structures the narrative is the meditative questioning of a set of ideas, rather than a treatise which provides only declarative answers. An essay is also relatively short, stripped to the exposition of a single idea. It's never broken down into subsections or chapters. It has a title that typically provides some sense of reference or at least humour, and it rarely features any footnotes. As resolutely a piece of writing, not typing, an essay also has ambitions towards a certain lyricism. For essays are mellifluous and free-flowing and sell their ideas as much through the compelling choice of words as through what is actually being said. Now, it should also be noted that a paper occupies the realms of science, whereas an essay is resolutely from the realms of art. Now, most essay writers have historically tried to define what they like about the essay, and most focus on the fact that it is so flexible, even mischievous, in its ability not to observe any rules. And so for Aldous Huxley, the essay is a literary device for saying almost everything about almost anything. Or for Samuel Johnson, it is a loose sally of the mind, an irregular, undigested piece, not a regular and orderly composition. Or Adorno's assertion that the effort of the essay reflects a childlike freedom that catches fire without scruple on what others have already done. Or lastly, the architectural historian Alan Colquhoun makes a more sort of academic point and says that the essay can be seen as a small part of the history of rhetoric dating from the Renaissance, and that it took scholarly writing from the hands of specialists, from the hands of specialists to the hands of all educated people. So it's more populist, more egalitarian. Now, for an architect whose professional responsibilities demand a level of propriety, a building has to stand up after all. The essay therefore offers a form of relief, a chance at non-conformity by constructing a work through an opposing set of registers. Vitruvius, long ago, told us that for a structure to be architectural, it must exhibit firmitas, or solidity, utilitas, or utility, and venustas, or delight, in that order. But the essay, through the kind of cleverness of its ideas and the compelling words it employs, has the ability to reorder Vitruvius's value system, which is still in effect today architecture's value system, making venustas the fundamental architectural quality. So through the essay, architecture then becomes a discipline about delight more than anything else. And interestingly, this form of writing about architecture, although sadly largely extinct now, was the norm for a golden generation of post-war architectural critics and historians, beginning with John Summerson, who you can see here. You see him twice, in effect. He's reflected in the mirror of the Soho Museum. Summerson, in addition to being a historian, was the director of the Soho Museum in London. Now, Summerson, if we apply the same test, the first line test, absolutely aces this test in that sort of nice, didactic, but very accessible way he had with writing. This is the famous opening passage of his book, George in London. I ask you to imagine yourself suspended a mile above London, and to imagine yourself staying up there for a period of time proportional to 2 centuries, with the years speeding past at 1 a second. The spectacle below you proceeds like one of those nature films which accelerate into immodest realism the slow drama of plant life. The life of a city condensed so would be so dramatic. That is a really wonderful beginning. Well, here's another essayist as part of the same kind of strain of English historians. This is Colin Rowe, who's a totally different kind of writer, but again, he only wrote in the essay form. So let's look at one of his first lines. Rowe was sort of famous for writing as he spoke, so everything was sort of anecdotal, slightly gossipy, camp, very funny and camp. And these are the opening sentences to his essay on Henry Russell Hitchcock. Again, this is an opening of an academic essay. Said Philip Johnson one day, "Oh, if only Russell had the gift of clarity, and if only Nicholas had an eye." Said Sybil Mahaly-Nagy slightly later, "Well, if Pevsner is the telephone book of architecture, then surely Hitchcock must be the Yellow Pages." Wrote Bernard Berenson in August 1955, Hitchcock, whom I recall as a rather rotund and unattractive young man, appeared yesterday transformed into a breezy, middle-aged, full but not loud-voiced Viking type of American. It's the type I fall for regardless of attainments and achievements, because I find them life-enhancing. Or here's Alan Colquhoun, again within this same lineage, less fluent as a writer, but still he only ever wrote in the essay form. Here's his opening sentence to his essay From Bricolage to Myth. Criticism occupies the no man's land between enthusiasm and doubt, between poetic sympathy and analysis. Following Colquhoun, I'm just working through these guys chronologically, and just a few months younger than Colquhoun was, of course, Banham himself, the most fluent of all writers. If you read any text in his posthumous collection of writings, A Critic Writes, you'll find that every single piece is written as an essay and has wonderful passages of writing. So this is his famous review of New Brutalism. Again, he's been slightly more didactic here, but again, it's a beautiful piece of writing. I'll let you read it yourself. Well, lastly, this is Robin Evans, who completes this sort of sweep of essayists, who really is a proper essayist, not only in terms of the way he wrote, but by the fact that he was self-taught, and he's also fundamentally solipsistic. You know, he's a sort of lonely, single kind of guy, Robin Evans. And he wrote perhaps the greatest first line of all after Pevsner: ordinary things contain the deepest mysteries. Now, in many ways, then, these five scholars, despite their shared mode of writing, each presented a different facet of the good essayist. Summerson, the essayist as sermonizer, Rowe, the essayist as raconteur, Colquhoun, the essayist as scholar, Banham, the essayist as populist, and Evans, the essayist as autodidact, someone who's self-taught. Now, I would argue that this variation, yet dedication to a single writing model, is a kind of paradigm we should aspire to. But in achieving this paradigm takes a lot of work, and this, I guess, is where the editor comes in, but also where the writer should be their own editor, or as Truman Capote would say, the importance of taking a pair of scissors to a text. I don't subscribe to the view that some people can write while others can't. I think you can engineer good writing. I also think you can teach writing by instilling a set of values that gives attention to every single word. My own role model in this attentiveness is this. This is the definitive editor as hero. This is a man called Gordon Lish, who was the literary editor of Alfred Knopf, the American, New York-based publisher in the 1960s and 70s. And in this role, he edited a huge number of American authors, including Richard Ford, Don DeLillo, but especially Raymond Carver. Now, Lish is famous for the extent of his editing. He was no copy editor, just correcting the spelling and grammar of his writers, but an editor who radically transformed the text in front of him. This is why he's a hero to editors, because he really changed things. So this is his edit of Raymond Carver's short story Beginners. And Lish even changes the whole title of the essay, so it's no longer called Beginners, it's called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. Elsewhere, Lish changes huge amounts from the original manuscript. He even changes the names of Carver's characters. So one character, Herb, becomes Mel, and ruthlessly trims and cuts the text in what readers would soon celebrate as Carver's characteristically spare and minimal prose. Here's a sort of slightly more graphic example of Lish editing Carver. Puts huge lines through the prose and the text and makes the sentence read, Herb finished his drink. Gin's gone, Herb said. Basta, that's it. Now, I think any piece of architectural writing needs the same level of editorial attention. Here, for example, is the extent of my own editing on a piece on the architect Ludwig Hilbersheimer by my friend Pier Vittorio Orelli, with whom I've worked together on lots of articles and books, and which I published. I published this one in AA Files a few years ago. Now, Microsoft Word track changes makes all of these changes seem like a lot, but in editing Pier Vittorio, just like anybody else, I want to bring out the ideas in a text, even introduce new ideas, while make it something that reads beautifully, sonorous, mellifluous, learned, but yet fast-paced. I think you need to be able to read good writing quickly. Bad writing is really slow to read. So these are the values that I really want to bring to the fore. I'm not there just to fix the typos, but to transform a text, to make it memorable. Now, this is how I do it, basically. I mean, I'm going to play for you now a little 3 or 4 minute film on how you edit. I mean, it's not so much an instruction on how you edit, but this is just me recording how I actually edited a text. This is another text by Pier Vittorio, this time not on Hildesheimer, but on Palladio. I'm just going to let this run just for a few minutes, but this is basically what you do, or what I do at least. And when I just begin by doing very, very boring things, just to make you feel as if you're actually working. So I save as the document, I change the language to English, not American. I change the font because it makes me feel more comfortable. I change all of the footnotes to endnotes. I don't like seeing footnotes because it just gets in the way of the sequence of the text. I remove double spaces and little things like that. And then I do base level spell checks. So with Pier Vittorio, perhaps the greatest contemporary writer on historical Italy, you discover he can't spell the word Renaissance. So you change the word Renaissance. And then with all of those little things out of the way, you actually have to sort of get down to the actual task of doing the editing. I mean, again, I just put his author's name in there just to get it straight. Then you start looking at the title. This seems like I'm doing a Gordon Lish. I did speak to Pier Vittorio before doing this, so I'm not just suddenly saying, that title's rubbish, here's a new one. But we retitled it. And then you actually just start the process of stitching the whole thing together. He has a very straight, very flat beginning, but I think that's okay. I don't think every beginning has to be pure poetry. You know, a date-based beginning is totally fine. And what I'm doing is as much as grammatical things, it's just trying to keep the text flowing, trying to keep it smooth. But for sure, you're correcting actual mistakes, dates of things, titles of books. All academics get these things wrong. The other thing slightly less confident writers do is that they always begin every sentence with the. So it reads like a sort of series of bullet points. So I try and smooth that out. So instead of the drawings, you sort of link it a little bit more, these drawings. So you're linking one sentence to another, always trying to increase the flow of the text. Pier Vittorio is very good at these thus words that are sort of more argumentative. Thus, this, it sort of shows an argument is developing. I showed this little film to Lars Lerup, the Swedish-American dean, and he said it was just like a piano, one of those pianos that plays itself. It's like a pianola. So that's just basically a little example of how the actual process of editing goes. But now I just wanted to show you some actual models of a few good beginnings and endings taken from texts I've edited and then published in AA Files. This is the first of them. This is a piece on Theo Crosby by Solomon Frausto. The first line here is actually paraphrasing a line written by Crosby himself. But it's so good that I just felt that it was nice just to apply it back on to Crosby. The first line is, Theo Crosby is a curious tomcat creature, ambivalent, wayward, solitary, compounded of purrs and claws. I mean, if you've got something as good as that, you just use it. Also note, I generally hate the academicization of titles where you use colons and a subtitle. I like titles to be more journalistic and very straight. So I'm including some of the titles here. I like titles that are a bit more playful or a little more ironic. Here's another nice example of a good beginning. This is another text on Palladio, or rather Palladio's battle drawings that Palladio drew all these military drawings, and it's by the Chilean historian Gabriela Garcia de Cortázar. And this has a great first line, talking about the fact that there's very little visual documentation of Palladio himself. So she says, it has always been easier to put a facade to Palladio than a face. A really neat, nice little beginning. Well, here's another example of a nice beginning. I'm trying to show different types of beginnings here. This is by an Australian academic called Ross Anderson. And he begins in a way that I like to use a lot, where he's physically describing an image. So he's simple through description. So this is a piece on Appia, who was a theatre designer in the turn of the century. And he writes, in one of the few surviving photographs of Adolphe Appia, the scenographer appears seated at his drawing board, wearing a striped nautical pull marin and canvas jacket. He gazes past lightly patterned curtains towards the distant horizon. Most of the room is lost in shadow as the light from the window falls on him. Heavily bearded and greying at the temples, there is something of the solitary prophet or ancient mariner about his bearing. Again, that's just totally flat description of a photograph, but it's a very, very nice way in to a profile of a figure and a historical figure. In terms of structuring text, I usually subscribe to the idea that a good piece of writing first describes, then it contextualizes, before it finally interprets and analyzes. And I like them in that order, mostly because most academic writing does it the other way around. It begins with a theoretical conceit or an analytical statement, and then it applies this onto an object. I always find that rather cumbersome. So I much prefer to be presented with a thing, with an object, and to appreciate all of its material thingness before then being led through an argument as to how and why it might represent a bigger set of ideas. Here's just another example of a nice beginning. So many academics begin with a date-based opening sentence. In June 1938, Mies van der Rohe sent a letter to Philip Johnson. That kind of beginning is the sort of default form of beginning. Now, I've done this myself, but I think you can make it slightly more exciting. This is an essay on Hans Hollein, and it has this nice date quote. One day in 1967, there was a knock at my door. Again, it's a date-based beginning, but it reads like a kind of detective novel or a kind of like a case note. It reads like something that you want to keep reading. You're curious to know what happens next. So it becomes rather more dramatic. Well, finally, just in terms of these beginnings, I wanted to show that not all introductions have to have a clear object, but that they can be more didactic. This is a beginning by Maria Giudici. He's basically giving a good impression of John Summerson and a kind of homily to the kind of grand historical but previously unnoticed narratives. Peel back the top layer of history and you'll often find a second history, an account of seemingly unimportant events that end up shaping our cities as much as the great narratives. So this is obviously an essay that's going to deal with something unseen, but she sort of sets it up in a nice didactic way. I was going to sort of lead you through the main components, the beginnings, the middles, and the end, but middles are so difficult to illustrate for you because there's so much text. I mean, you wouldn't be able to read it on the screen. So, my instruction for middles is basically just to keep everything flowing, to link beginnings to ends. So let's just skip on to endings. If my preferred beginning is the clearest paragraph of any text, my preferred conclusion is either the most polemical or the most lyrical set of sentences. So save up your best lines for the end. Never let an ending just peter out, just sort of disappear. Always go out with a bang or with a kind of sonnet. So here's a nice one. This is by a former student of mine, an Australian historian called Emma Jones, and she's writing about Schinkel. So her last paragraph, I realise you can't read it completely like that, is like a kind of mini essay all on its own, and it has a very mellifluous, kind of free-flowing ending, which riffs on the famous painting by Caspar David Friedrich, The Wanderer Over a Sea of Fog, that you see here, and she uses that as a kind of emblem of Schinkel's own kind of sense of having a commanding view over architecture. And her final line, which I quote to you, It quotes a diary entry from Schinkel the day after he climbed to the top of Mount Etna. Schinkel writes, "I believed the whole world below me could be grasped with a single look. The distances seemed so small, the breadth of the sea to the shores of Africa, the expanse of southern Calabria, the island itself. Everything lay so clearly below me that I thought myself in comparison almost larger." Again, I think that's a nice, really beautiful kind of end of a profile or figure. Oh, here's another one. This is another great ending. This is an essay on Robin Evans. I usually don't like endings that introduce something new. I think endings are like the end of a party. I think you don't want to meet anyone new at 2 o'clock in the morning. You want to be leaning against the fridge in the party, just talking to someone you like. I think endings should be pure ideas. Joseph slightly breaks this model by introducing the idea that Evans was planning a lecture series just before he died. So he's sort of anticipating the next thing that Evans may have gone on to if he hadn't died. And his final line is very sort of poetic. He writes, "For just as Robin Evans was asking about the imagination, he was at the same time also asking about the self. And where else could the self be if not somewhere inside?" Here's the final one. This is by a friend of mine called Davide Spina, who I've worked with on several occasions. This is his conclusion to a long essay on the Villa Malaparte. Now, the original ending he gave me was a bit flat, a bit dull, and so I encouraged him to get angrier and give me something much more argumentative. And he produced this, which really tears into the villa and sort of rubbishes whole ideas of Italy. He begins his conclusion by stating that, "For in large part, Italy remains resolutely hostile to the modern paradigm, fascist in its moral code, provincial in its outlook, and afflicted with an undiminished sense of its own national importance, in spite of its now blatantly marginal position in global affairs." So he's tearing into something, and I think that is a proper ending. That's a proper argument. But as good as these examples are, and as useful as the essay is as a mode of conveying complex ideas in an accessible way, I don't think all good writing needs to take this form. As Alice says, I think actually good writing can take the form of good conversation, or even more radically, of an image. In my own way, there's something I've tried to do in AA Files. I very rarely commission architects to write, because as we know, they cannot write. But I was constantly encouraging them to talk. Architects are terrible writers, but almost uniformly brilliant at talking. And what they are best at talking about is, strangely, not their projects, but their lives, or simply telling stories or anecdotes. And so this, I think, is a completely valid form in which we should consume architectural voices, as the transcript of oral histories. And so just as a little kind of intermission now, I just want to quickly play you 3 bursts of architects actually talking as audio, so that you can hear how good they are. Each of them were recorded through conversations I've conducted with them, and then I published them. And alongside the audio, I'll show slides of the edited transcript, so that you can read as they speak. You'll also see slight differences in terms of the way they've been transcribed as opposed to the way they actually spoke, but you'll see that that's part of the editorial process. So this is the first of them. This one.
Who else of your contemporaries did you admire?
That's Adrian Forty, who did the conversation with me.
Sterling? Who's your contemporary?
Conversation with him, so we shared a flat together on the same season. And during that time I got to know fairly well, obviously, we shared a flat. And I can remember we were out having a walk, and he said to me, "John, there are 2 types of architects. There are people like Philip Johnson and myself, who were designing key buildings for humanity. And there are people who design all board buildings in between, for example, people like you." And I thought, oh yeah, bloody rude. Absolutely correct. It makes it worse. And I think he was absolutely right.
I should have said that John Winter is like a kind of the first English high-tech architect, actually a proto-Foster in many ways. Very, very interesting figure. Here's another one. This is Massimo Scolari, who for many years taught drawing in Venice, at the School of Architecture in Venice, and then currently teaches at Yale.
You know, after 40 years, 50 years of looking drawing, it takes you 2 seconds to see from a drawing if something is beautiful or not.
And also to see
It's
if
like
they have
what-
knowledge or...
It's like with the musician. If you go to the School of Music and you witness a selection for singers, or every passage, another one, you follow another one. I mean, it's very easy for somebody. Yes.
So you must have encountered students who are excellent students, who are articulate and full of original ideas, but who can't draw.
Yes, Peter,
That's true.
He has a lot of knowledge.
yeah. No, yes, there are students that they are, but not today. I must say that that was a characteristic of maybe 20 years ago, that you can have students very cultivated, very theoretical, very philosophical oriented, but not gifted. Usually coming from the classical high school. But today this attitude doesn't exist anymore. The students, they don't read. I was always telling to my students at Yale, listen, when you read a book and you start to have a very little headache, that is a moment in which something happens in your brain and the knowledge starts to be. If you read a book and you have no headache, it's useless. I mean, just drop it.
Okay, last one. This is Kevin Roach, who worked with Saarinen in the 1950s on all of those kind of amazing Saarinen buildings, TWA Terminal, the GM Technical Center, and then he set up on his own with John Dinkeloo. And I'm talking to him here. He had a very, very brief moment when he was studying with Mies. So he's talking about his experiences of studying at IIT.
The issue was to design a house.
That was the brief, was it?
And of course, everyone said it was small in Chicago. And I thought, why the hell would you design a bedroom for you? What's that? Why don't you do what they did in Scandinavia? And very someone design a house and pitched room first.
So you invented the picture.
That's right. He said, you could do that, but I will not do that, you know.
And that was the end of that.
At the end of that was my education from these.
But did he patrol, did he run it like as if it was an office? So was the ambience there not a...
He had a group of 3 or 4 guys who were
his assistants?
assistants. And they sort of ran things. But I must say, I was really quite disappointed about the undergraduates. They seem to spend all their time drawing bricks. You know, why do you get so many bricks between 2 steel columns?
Yes. Well, in terms of the bonds, of course.
Oh, then the thickness of the joint.
Yeah.
Then you get the red bond, and then you got the whole bond at the end of it.
So design was, in a sense, about fitting things together, not about challenging the steel or the brick.
No such thing as solving problems,
No.
or understanding what it is, or giving concepts, something like that. It's how you draw this.
So good. You can hear he's Irish, Kevin Roach, but he's been in the States for 70 years. He's still alive, it's amazing. Kevin Roach is still alive, 95 years old. I just wanted to go on to terms of other components of this sort of the visual medium. So as an editor and a publisher, but also as a student putting together a thesis, I think it's also important to recognize that architecture's language is still fundamentally a visual medium. And so images have to work alongside text. An image, as we know, is also often more articulate and communicative and frankly better than any text. And so if you find yourself, say, writing about Saul Steinberg's early career as an architect, then don't be afraid to simply reproduce some Saul Steinberg drawings. They communicate an idea. Or if you uncover an early example of a high-tech architecture in the form of a great photo montage by Jan Kleplicki, then just show it really big, show the drawing, let the image speak for itself, let it become its own sentence. In this sense, I think words and images should always be understood as existing on the same level. Text should never be reduced to simple captions, to the main focus of the image, and nor should images simply just be figures or examples to references made in the text. Rather, they should coexist. This coexistence can also mean that associations can be flipped. Texts need not always carry ideas, interpretations, and provocations, and the image merely the description. Sometimes the text can describe and images can interpret. So here, for example, is for me one of the single best architectural drawings of the 20th century, Hans Hollein's aircraft carrier in a landscape from 1964, a drawing that is full of nuance and meaning. So allow the drawing to convey this, while use the text to simply describe when it was made, the landscape in which it was inserted, and where the aircraft carrier came from. You can also convey the idea of coexistence graphically. So let sentences and images be as articulate as each other by separating them, by allowing the reader to indulge in both. So you reproduce an image filling a page and you reproduce text filling a page. Another example here, you can make the kind of clarity and strength of your graphic design mirror the clarity and strength of your words and images. Now, this system of layout is an older model. It's pre-computer. It's an analog model of layout, because with an analog letterpress system, it was very difficult and time-consuming to place images with and around text. It had to be done physically. But with the introduction of desktop publishing 20 years ago, you could very easily place images within text. You just click and you drag an image in. But I think this has had a detrimental effect on the way we write, and that we've been over-reliant on images. So everything now becomes like a kind of Pinterest or Google image page, where the text is only a caption or just some kind of self-justification. Now, the best model, I think, for this older system of separating image and text is not found in any architectural book, but it's most compellingly illustrated in Diderot and D'Alembert's wonderful 18th century encyclopedia, where you have text pages which are then paralleled with illustrative plates. The two of them always work in tandem. Moreover, these plates articulate a very interesting and appealing view of architecture, where you are shown the spaces in which the various industries Diderot is describing take place. In this case, this is the letter making and physical type making. These interiors that he shows are kind of unusually modern, with simple, unadorned interiors and functional furniture. And then the objects necessary for these industries are sort of aligned next to them. So the part is always seen alongside the whole. The space is seen alongside its use. Again, I think it's a really compelling way of actually creating an architectural narrative. Now, I was reminded of the value of the encyclopedia by a great essay by Roland Barthes, where he uses the example of Diderot to talk about the value of the object, and speaks about objects as carriers not just of detail but of meaning. As Barthes writes, by separating image from text, the encyclopedia committed itself to an autonomous iconography of the object, whose power we enjoy today since we no longer look at these illustrations with mere information in mind. In architecture, I think you have seen an opposite tradition to literature, that it has taken a relatively short period of time to forget the object, and that in too much architectural writing now, it is difficult to discern what the author is actually talking about. As a result, architectural criticism today, we get lots of philosophy, but we have completely lost the building or the architect. Now, I think this is something that should be resisted, not simply because architecture's objects, its buildings, its books, its drawings, its photo collages, and the architects themselves are so compelling, but because writing about them makes the resulting sentences, essays, and books all the more interesting. So here, just to reiterate, I think we should ignore Mark Wigley's advice not to write about architecture and instead make the objects of architecture and design our fundamental focus. And alongside Diderot and Barthes, the witness I would call to support this idea would be the great German Romantic writer Goethe. This is Goethe, famous painter, who said that we should only write about architecture, or as he put it in his Italian journey in 1816, I shall never rest until I know that all my ideas are derived not from hearsay or tradition, but from my real living contact with the things themselves. Now, more recently, architectural critics like Ken Frampton and Rainer Banham say exactly the same thing, that you should never write about a building you've not first seen. Or we could take another literary guide, this is Gustave Flaubert, who says the physicality of the object can inspire two different modes of writing. He says that in me, when it comes to literature, there are two quite distinct creatures. One who's very taken with being a loudmouth, with lyricism, with soaring like an eagle, with all the sonorities of phrase and loftiness of idea. The other who digs and delves into the truth as far as he can, who loves to represent the little detail as powerfully as the other kind, who would like to make you feel almost materially the objects he describes. Now, I really think this is a model for the perfect writer. So you're both a poetic loudmouth and a diligent digger. In fact, I think that one is a consequence of the other. First dig and then show off what you've discovered. Or as the American poet Wallace Stevens put it more succinctly, description is revelation. In architectural terms, describing the spaces people have designed or the spaces they occupy becomes the task at hand. Or as another American poet, this time Marianne Moore, describes it, people's surroundings, they answer one's questions. Now for me, the best illustration of this concerns a wonderful painting in the National Gallery in London. This is a detail from Antonello de Messina's painting, St. Jerome in his study. It's from 1475. Jerome was famous for two things, for translating the Hebrew Bible into Latin, creating the Vulgate Bible, and for the allegorical story of him taming a lion by taking a thorn out of its paw. As a result, in paintings of St. Jerome, and there are lots and lots of paintings of St. Jerome, he's always depicted surrounded by books, lost in translation, and with a very friendly and grateful lion nearby. You just see the lion in the corner. I've always liked this painting, largely because it offers such an appealing advert for architecture. There's actually two types of architecture. There's a kind of medieval architecture of this main space, and then there's a very kind of hyper-modern architecture of the kind of plywood, MDF almost construction. It looks like Donald Judd has sort of designed his sort of studiolo. So it would be my flag for how I would actually sell architecture. Now, I later discovered that the painting also offers a very appealing advert for architectural writing. In his book, Species of Spaces, the great French novelist Georges Perec writes about this painting, but with the constraint that he could only write through description. So this is the conclusion to a short text he writes. And again, I think it's something that all aspiring architectural writers should have as a kind of touchstone. You should pin this up on your kind of by your desk. As Perec writes at the end of the text, the whole space is organized around the piece of furniture, and the whole of the piece of furniture is organized around the book. The glacial architecture of the church, the bareness of the tiling, the hostility of the piers has been cancelled out. Its perspectives and its vertical lines have ceased to delimit the sight simply of an ineffable faith. They are there solely to lend scale to the piece of furniture, to enable it to be inscribed. Surrounded by the uninhabitable, the study defines a domesticated space inhabited with serenity by cats, books, and men. Such aspiring architectural writers could also feel liberated by the fact that although this is a nice model of writing, it's not the only one, just as there are in fact lots of versions of paintings of St. Jerome in his study on which to draw upon, all of them unified only by their architecture, their occupant, their books, and by their lions. So here's one by the Dutch painter. This is by Hendrik van Steenwijk. Again, it's exactly the sort of same diagram, kind of friendly lion and an architectural space and the book. Oh, here's another pair. This is by Antonio da Fabriano on the left and by Stefan Lochner on the right. Again, same subject, St. Jerome in his study. Oh, here's another pair. This is by Dürer on the left and by Lucas Cranach on the right, which joined together actually kind of forms a rather nice room. Or another by Vincenzo Catena. Now, all of these different species of spaces and the possibilities they offer for different but uniformly enlightening pieces of writing is again something I've consciously tried to do with the things I've published, being quite explicit about the concreteness of the objects under discussion, be they architects and designers like Hildesheimer, Malaparte, Lasden, or Albers. These are just title pages from A files. Or equally concrete products of architecture, like Bourrier's Ghibellina, Le Corbusier's Maison Domino, the Peabody Estates, or Kohlhaas's Villa de Lava. Or even about those objects drawn from disciplines outside of architecture, like classics, fashion, semiotics, the history of science, art, and psychoanalysis. A similar love of the object informed the physical, tactile aspect of the journal itself. So I like to create something that is incredible. I was interested not in e-books, but in the physicality of the object. Something with, very profound sense of colour. Actually, two colours, inside colours, outside colours. Something with a concrete fold out. So you play with architectural drawings. You make the drawing itself an object. Another fold out here. Or you have a pop-up. You have actually an image that works like architecture, it works vertically. Or you have a cutout. Again, you can create a hole in a page. It's very easy to do this now. Or you reveal hidden things within the magazine. The Italian architect Gio Ponti used to write 20 letters every single day, and I published a piece on one of those letters. So I felt I just had to publish, reproduce the letter itself. And the letter itself was drawn in the form of an image. He conveyed ideas through images, so it was just a boiled egg. Or lastly, among this survey of issues, I found that you can even smuggle architecture itself into the journal, folding it down into something very, very small, that then unfolds into something enormous. Now this is just to kind of wrap it up now, anyone who writes or edits or especially publishes architecture should, I feel, indulge in all of these things, in a multitude of architectural objects and in a multitude of different kinds of writing. But in doing so, I feel I should also warn you that you will necessarily find yourself haunted by two things. The first, as we have seen, is the ghost of all of those terrible sentences and that long, enduring lineage of abject architectural writing, a canon into which you are willfully entering. The second is a frightening prophecy made by the writer Victor Hugo in 1832. This is the title of a famous chapter in Hugo's Gothic horror story, Notre Dame de Paris, the novel that features Quasimodo and the hunchback, and who lives in the bell tower of Notre Dame Cathedral. But to architectural publishers, far more scary than any hunchback is what this sentence conveys. The line is spoken by the novel's antagonist, Claude Frollo, who's the archdeacon of the cathedral, who at one point in the narrative argues that until the advent of printing, buildings had been the books of humanity, that it was through stone, not paper, that thoughts, ideas, and memories were committed. And so for Frollo, when the book took over the task of recording these things, it emptied architecture of culturally relevant meanings, since when architecture was dead. So the this in this equation is the printing press. And the that is architecture, represented here and in the novel by Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. By definition, then, anyone publishing books is killing architecture, an association made tragically ironic when the book is an architectural book. But even though the fear of the destruction of one by the other may be real or even useful, I hope that I've shown that you can survive in a world where the two things coexist, and where books or simply sentences can be shown to nurture and protect architecture as much as they are engaging with the things in their own right. Patron to this could even be yet another Saint Jerome, this time painted by the Florentine Renaissance artist Masaccio, who dispenses with the study altogether, so he dispenses with the space, and instead depicts the saint alongside John the Baptist, proudly carrying the two things that define him, the book in his right hand and the building in his left hand, and whose harmonious coexistence the friendly lion seems to be looking up towards approvingly. That's it. Thanks.